time. So anyway, enough of that. I'm going to get to that part 3. So back to part 1 with the historical and economic and political effort. We were at that time, after the French Revolution, beginning of the 1800s, we were up to the part of the Second Bank of the United States, which is a big area of contention between President Andrew Jackson and Nicholas Biddle, who was the head of the bank and hooked up really tightly with the powers that be in Europe at the time. And old Biddle made all various threats. I'm going to bring them to their knees and all. Very powerful individuals. So it was a real battle going on there. And last week I mentioned that this was very timely in the sense that politically you had individuals like Alfred Lord Tennyson in the early 1840s, just a few years after the Jackson measure that defeated the Second Bank of the U.S. And Nicholas Biddle vowing revenge in Locksley Hall, talking about, quote, the Parliament of Man in the Federation of the World. And so at that time, in the 30s, about the time of Jackson's vote, about the time Tennyson was going to write it, you had a young fellow named John Ruskin matriculating at Oxford University. And he believed that Parliament of Man and the Federation of the World really should be run by the best Northern blood. So when they talk about the Parliament of Man, they're not talking about third world people, having an equal voice. No. They are the best Northern blood, the elite. And that's why after Ruskin had matriculated at Oxford in 1836, which was a few years after, in this country, you had Skull and Bones founded in 1832 by an individual, William Russell, who had matriculated himself at a couple of the universities over in the Bavarian region where the Illuminati had a strong student society group. What happened was Ruskin then later on comes back and teaches at Oxford University. And I put in my book, The Globalist, an actual picture near the front of Ruskin's gravestone, and on the top of it is a swastika.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back here. Well, this is Dr. Stan. Dr. Cuddy's really talking about something, a period in the 1830s, 1840s, and people say, why would you be so worried about something 1830, 1840? Well, because it was a lot of important things taking place at that time. Certainly the man named Russell went to Europe and was affiliated with the secret Bavarian Society, came back and formed Skull and Bones, I think about 1832, and then of course it was at that time when Andrew Jackson was having his battle with the bank, because the bankers working with the secret societies in Europe wanted to control our country, and Andrew Jackson was able to defeat them. And if you haven't seen my little pamphlet on the prophetic warning, which is a summary of the farewell address of Andrew Jackson in 1837, and then of course about 1841-42 you have certainly Lord Tennyson writing about the Parliament of Man, the Federation of the World, a poem called Locksley Hall. You had certainly a man named Ruskin studying at that time. Ruskin then would go on to Oxford University in the 1870s and indoctrinate a young man and certainly members of the Rothschild family into this idea of creating a world government under a ruling elite. And of course then Cecil Rhodes in 1891 who would create the secret society which became the Council on Foreign Relations, which was the forerunner of the Trilateral Commission, which dominates America today and dominates the world. Of course, you see what's going on over in Europe, where we have a new premier appointed in Greece about 4 months ago. His name is Papademos. He just happens to come from the Trilateral Commission. He isn't elected by the people. He just was appointed. And then, of course, a premier appointed in Italy. Who appointed him? Nobody's quite sure. He was just appointed, and he comes from the Trilateral Commission. These little people control everything, and they control Barack Obama. There's only 80 of them in America, and at least initially 12 of them, of those 80 people, were on the initial administration of Barack Obama. So this all ties into what happened so many years ago. Dr. Cuddy, you pick up the story.
Yeah, and these people that come from out of nowhere, there's reasons they do, whether it's in Italy or Greece, and it's sort of like Javier Solana. He's teaching physics, right, at the University of Virginia. Now he's one of the most powerful men in the world because he was, placed in that position by the Rhodes Scholar Network, primarily Bill Clinton and his Rhodes Scholar roommate Strobe Talbot and their buddy Rhodes Scholar Richard Gardner, who was Clinton's ambassador to Spain, which is where Solana came from. So the gang there, following along with Cecil Rhodes' effort. And like you said about Lord Rothschild, in Cecil Rhodes' original will, the members of the Circle of Initiates, about 7 of them, included Lord Rothschild, but then he didn't want to be too prominent, so I think he was replaced by Lord Rosebery a little bit later on, and there's a whole story to that too.
That was his son-in-law, right?
Yeah. So what you have is way in advance these things happen, and so in this case you have young John Ruskin matriculating at Oxford in 1836, 4 years after William Russell had founded Skull and Bones. After he matriculated over in a couple of Bavarian, Tugendbund and another one over there in Bavaria, where the Illuminati had a very strong student society. And it's true that the Illuminati was discovered and outed or whatever in the 1780s, but they didn't all get rounded up like most of the Templars did. They simply dispersed, They became tutors of various princes for Alexander I when he was a prince, and an Illuminati tutor, and then Alexander becomes Tsar of Russia in about 1825 or so. So anyway, and I put a picture in my book, September 11th, Prior Knowledge. That book I did back in, I think, chapter 4. I put a picture of the sort of spiring statue with the Illuminati symbol on it that's dedicated to Alexander I, and there's a reason for that stuff. Okay, so in the late 1860s, Ruskin comes back. 1869, starts teaching. In the early 70s, what happens is a young Cecil Rhodes is sitting there, and he's writing down word for word Ruskin's philosophy in one of the lectures, and he just loves this best Northern blood stuff. And he thinks, hey, this is what I'm going to devote my life to. And as Dr. Sand said about the Second Bank of the U.S., Biddle being connected with the power elite in Europe actually owned a sizable portion of that Second Bank of the U.S. back in the 30s. They try to keep it all hush-hush, really quiet, sort of like the Federal Reserve, who really owns it. I mean, you can find out, but it's not, you don't just go on Google and punch in their website, the Federal Reserve, and pops up the owners. They're not going to put it there. So anyways, a lot of these power elite guys are into the ownership of these various banks, which are private entities. The Federal Reserve is private; it's not government at all. And so what you have then, Cecil Rhodes, as Dr. Stead said, forms a secret society in 1891. Now, he'd been building it. William Stead was actually the one sort of figuring out who should be on the thing. And there's a whole list of them before 1891. It's like 1897 and 98. Now, I think Flora Lewis, who was William Stead's chief reporter there with his Pell-Mell Gazette, who he sent to Egypt, not by accident. Not by accident, he sent Flora Lewis to Egypt, because this is right after Al-Afghani, the Iranian, who had gone to Egypt, hooks up with the British intelligence back in the late 1800s, say, hey, let's have a pan-Islamic strategy. And that way, you can undermine this nationalism among all these Arab countries, see? Okay, so it's all really worked out well. So, 1891, he's got a secret society, Cecil Rhodes. And in the early 1900s, as I said, you start to have the hereditary aspect of this picked up by the Rockefellers following the Rothschilds, primarily in this country. And as I've indicated in Thomas Lawson's book, Frenzied Finance, 1904, it was actually a collection of his articles from what was called Everybody's Magazine. That's the title of it, like Life Magazine, Everybody's Magazine. He had a series of these articles, and so they collect them in 1904, same year as the articles were published. And you can find this on Google Books. You can look there and you can see the thing. And so Thomas Lawson writes this Frenzied Finance, and in there he's talking about this sort of religion. He calls it a religion that these people, Rockefeller, for example, have. And if you join them, you'll be fabulously wealthy. But he says if you cross these guys, and he's sort of one of them. He's a minor member, Thomas Lawson.